Large numbers of Zambia voters turned out early to beat the 6 o'clock closing time. But according to the Electoral Commission, close to 150 stations accessible to them only by air were unable to open due to bad weather. The administrative delays could scuttle plans to have all results in by Thursday ahead of scheduled Friday inauguration. The Electoral Commission of Zambia says it's working flat out to ensure every designated station opens for at least 12 hours. Thousands made their way to polling stations to cast their votes in the capital of Lusaka, but it's a tight race for the presidential seat between Edgar Lungu, leader of the ruling Patriotic Front, over main rival Hakainde Hichilema, a businessman whose United Party for National Development has won over the middle class and investors. Lungu's campaign has focused on tapping into the grassroots support base of the late Zambian President Michael Sata. At the polling stations, voters said they were satisfied with the arrangements. The Commission remains confident that counting will continue on Wednesday as planned, the outcome announced on Thursday and the inauguration of the new president on Friday. And for more on that, we're now joined by Vuyo Mvoko, our contributing editor covering the elections in Lusaka, Zambia. Good evening, Vuyo, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, Vuyo, can you give us a roundup of how voting went in Zambia?
Well, by and large, I think went really smoothly. Mother Nature, of course, as you were saying earlier, didn't play ball in certain places. We were told earlier in the afternoon that over 160 polling stations were affected, but of course some measures were put in place to compensate for that. In other words, where you have a polling station having opened 4 hours later, they would close 4 hours later than the 6 p.m. deadline. So those are some of the measures, but also there were reinforcements by way of sending in more personnel. So the IEC really doesn't expect major problems, the sort of problems that would mean that they veer off their original plan. The original plan being counting will happen tomorrow, and we will have an announcement of the result the next day. And as the state has been planning, there will be an inauguration of the new president of Zambia on Friday. Lulu?
Now, Vuyo, were there any issues with regards to the delays in material delivery for voting, or was it just only the bad weather?
Well, it wasn't just the bad weather. There were sporadic incidents of intimidation and intolerance. But from what the Electoral Commission told us, they were few and far between. They were nipped in the bud. State security forces were brought in to deal with those issues, and the situation was brought back to normal, and none of them were major.
Now, vote counting, has it started? And as you mentioned that there's a 4-hour delay for most of the polling stations that didn't open on time. When are you expecting the early results to start trickling in?
I think we will only get a sense tomorrow, but in the next hour, the Electoral Commission will be holding a media briefing right here in this auditorium where I am. As you can see behind me, some of the journalists, lots of journalists actually have already gathered here, and more are expected. So we will get a briefing in the next hour as to how things went, how many polling stations were affected, the sort of measures that were put in place. Did they really work, and are they indeed staying to their sticking to their deadlines that they had set earlier? All of that will be clarified in the next hour or so right here in this hall.
Now, Vuyo, about the people of Zambia, did you manage to speak to any of them after they had cast their ballots?
Yes, we did. We spoke to them as they were going to the polling stations, at the polling stations themselves, and afterwards. Zambians were were full of praise given the amount of work that they say was put into the effort of conducting this election, queues were moving fairly fast, and people were hardly inconvenienced. Of course, the commission did say that there were people who had problems, like they could not see their names on the ballot box, or they were voting at wrong places, but all of that was either clarified or explained to people, and generally people accepted that in large part they were the ones that were on the wrong, or there was some misunderstanding rather on their part. But after that, they didn't really get any serious complaints. The leaders also, after casting their votes, were in fact full of praise for the effort that the Electoral Commission put into this election. If anything, they had problems among and within themselves as political parties.
Vuyo, thank you so much for joining us. That was Vuyo Mvoko, SABC contributing editor, coming to us live from Lusaka in Zambia.